Okay, cool. So, I had a discussion with an anarcho-communist in a long dead Facebook group. I just kind of shared my content to, and somebody started replying. Not very many people in here, but I've said before, I used to consider myself a communist. So I think that I have a decent compass when it comes to navigating through these beliefs, because I used to believe this stuff too, and then I realized, hey, that makes no sense, and that's why I no longer consider myself a communist. Depending on what that means. I consider myself a market anarchist, and I don't usually consider myself an anarcho-capitalist. If anything, just because of the semantical the contextual baggage, or the connotative baggage, rather, that word could carry. Because I think some things that anarcho-communists take as given are not actually consistent with anarchist philosophy, though whether or not they are fundamental aspects of capitalism is another question, which I don't think they are. So I don't consider myself to be against capitalism. I think it's an absurd thing to say for a couple of reasons, but that's for a different video, I guess. So I posted my video, "Public Property Does Not Exist." He doesn't know it was me, though. He says the weirdo in the video keeps reasserting this premise over and over in different ways without supporting it, though. I mean, it's logic. I've supported it by explaining the logic of it in the video, which is on my YouTube. So, but his first comment is property. He wrote "Public property doesn't exist," but then he struck out "public." So property doesn't exist. And then he posted the anarchist FAQ, "Why Anarchists Are Against Private Property," which I've read that a couple times in the past. I'll get to some of it, the meat of it. But so, he says property doesn't exist. So my reply was, well, then I guess the capitalists didn't steal anything. Like, a market anarchist, we understand why that logically that statement makes no sense, right? Because in order to say theft as a concept is a thing, you have to presuppose the existence of property, right? You can't have theft without property. In two different ways you can mean that, like in this conceptual way, and obviously if you have no property, nobody can steal your property. They might be able to hurt your body and threaten you and stuff, but if you have no property, nobody can steal your property. But so, and here's actually, I didn't even see this comment earlier. I'm going through this right now. So I said, then the capitalists didn't steal anything, and his reply was, property is theft. And I said, that makes no sense. You need the concept of property to have theft. Theft implies property or property right, yada, yada. And then I just kind of quoted his statements, which make no sense, starting with, I said, property is theft, property doesn't exist. Well, okay, well, what does that even mean? Like, which one of those is true? And obviously can't be true. If property doesn't exist, then there really can't be any theft of property, right? So then property is theft and earth is common inheritance. And I said, these propositions are absurd. They contradict each other. Well, I didn't say they contradict each other yet. I'll get into that. I'm in a second here outline what I've noticed are the fundamentally contradictory presuppositions that they hold. And I used to hold as well. And that's how I can kind of see them for what they are. And maybe market anarchists that come from a Republican background, they can see them too. But anyway, I said that earth is common inheritance. I don't think he said, it might be in that anarchist fact because I didn't read it, just to kind of refresh myself with what it was saying. But that is like the first principle of their belief, basically, is that earth is common inheritance. And he later says that, and I'll get to that. But he says you can make up countless other institutions other than property to negotiate the use of physical objects. And really, you can't, that is that institution. That is the quote institution. The concept is property, negotiate the use of physical objects. I mean, whatever you want to call that, what you're doing is you're managing the property, the quote property, this abstract concept of property, the property. I don't know which property we're talking about. Communists talk about all property, really, but they don't understand that. But so no, you can't. Logically, that is what that is. To negotiate the use of physical objects. No, you cannot come up with countless other quote institutions or concepts to do that, because that is what that is. The physical objects are the property. You can call it whatever you want, but that's essentially the same thing that you're doing. The property is just kind of a catch-all phrase in this context. You're negotiating the use of physical objects. Another way to say that is you're managing the property. basically from a position of ownership in the general context here. But so none of these have any inherent metaphysical existence outside the behaviors of human beings. And I'm not saying that they do. I mean, obviously, wood exists external of human beings in their social context and whatnot. But, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about we're talking about the concept of property itself. So, and there's ICE reply. I'm not saying they exist outside of human action. I'm saying that you must recognize at least fully property rights to make a claim of theft. You cannot claim something as theft without acknowledging property. It's logically absurd. And that's one of the main points here of taking Proudhon's property as theft is just literally for what it is. It doesn't make any damn sense because theft implies property. So, and then he says again, you are presuming incorrectly that property is the only system of negotiating use and occupancy. And I made the googly eye face because I don't know what to say to that. Like, I'm not incorrectly presuming that. That is what that quote system is. The system of negotiating use and occupancy of things and stuff and places. That's the management of property in some context or another, social or independently or individually. And then he says, my last claim was false. My claim that you must recognize property at least to make a claim of theft, he says that's false. The link above describes possession as an alternative to property relations, and that's just totally does not make any sense because it does not describe possession as an alternative to property relations. It describes quote possession as an alternative property relation. You see what I'm saying? So it's not, like his claim is not making any damn sense, and it's not, I'm not trying to sound all mean and whatnot. It's just, that's the fact of the matter. Let me just kind of go through that again, which I think it's pretty self-evident just by the way he said. The link above describes quote possession as an alternative to property relations. And it's not. It's, if we go back to what he's saying here, the where did it go there? Where did it go? The negotiating of use of physical objects, right? So that's not a possession as is put forth in their document. It's not an alternative to property relations. It's an alternative property relationship, kind of. It's an alternative system of property relations. And that's why I said that's still property. And he says more assertions without support. And it's just, I might be poor at articulating what I'm trying. I didn't actually say it the way that I'm saying right now, but that's what I'm thinking. And I didn't necessarily put it forth in that way. And maybe I will later if he comes back. He said he had to go slave for the man. So I said that you cannot logically claim someone else stole something without arguing the existence of property. It comes along with it because of theft implied. So you calling it occupancy doesn't change that you're still considering it property, i.e. someone's rightful possessions, And so that's just the whole issue that I'm putting forth here. And I just had a thought that I thought was off a previous comment to his in regards to that, someone's rightful possessions, because he says, rightful somewhere in here. He says rightful, usage of whatever. So it's like he's accepting the concept of property rights, as I'm saying, and this is what I have been saying since I've realized all of this, years ago, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, maybe. Anyway, so they have a different conception of the same thing. They have what the argument is over is what constitutes rightful ownership. It's not whether property should or shouldn't exist. It's what constitutes or does or doesn't, because they take property as a given. Like we, market anarchists, we say, because we can see that in a meta sense, it's the same thing. It's not an alternative to property relations. It's just a different method, based on a different fundamental principle of, property relations. So it's still a system of property relations. Like to say that something belongs to someone is to say that it's their property. And even in the context where they have this, what I would say, false wedge that they try to stick between personal and private property, regardless of that, it's still a claim of rightful use in the sense of a house. Like you're not going to say that a person is rightfully entitled to their possessions, and that's not the same thing as property, which is what he's saying, and that is what they say. Or they'll say it's not the same thing as private property, but really it is. It is. Their definition of private property is a little different, but and when they make the sound case against what they view that to be, they are correct. Like if they view private property be specifically feudal so-called property relations, where a guy is said to own a vast expanse of land without ever laboring on it or even funding anybody to labor on it. He just claims it's his land. Right. That is illegitimate, but it's because production is the rightful basis of property. And try to get to that as well later, because that does come about. And so and like he obviously so he quotes me in this video, but he doesn't quote the fundamental crux of it, which maybe I should go back. Maybe I did have a hard time articulating it, but he says that I just keep repeating, you can't have public property because all property is private, which, I mean, that is basically what I'm saying. And I also, though, did say that public property is a complete misnomer, because there's no such thing. I mean, the concept of in economics of a public good is not what public property is. Like if you look up what public property is, it says it's state property. And so they're not making a type of different claim of what property is or what type of property it is. They're saying it is owned by an entity they call the state. The confusion of the public property comes in the sense that it's said it is state property that is put for public use. So it's still exclusive in control, right? Because the state is the quote steward that controls and makes the rules. It's just they say it's open to public use, and it's not even that, because they close the parks and they make the rules on which. So the point of that is that property itself. The point of that, you can't put all property is private, because property itself is the notion that someone or some group has the right and is entitled to exclude others. So when they take this concept of public property, it's state property, which they mean the state has the right to exclude others. It's just the conflation that the state is the representative of the public, and then they use it for the public's use. And that's all nonsense. It's all a lie. The same thing is happening is some group is claiming it is their property, and then some group is deciding how they're going to distribute their property. The fact that the state has no rightful claim to those areas doesn't change that. That's how they act. That is how they act. They act as if it's private property that they decide to let the public have access to, not even in an entire sense, because a public good is literally impossible for you to deny access to someone to a public good. That is what the concept is. So public property is a nonsense concept. It's an attempt to blend two different things, the concept of a public good and the concept of property, which is not the same thing at all. And so maybe I probably should go back through that video. Maybe I can make a better one because the camera was all shaky too, but I might not have articulated that quite as well as I thought I did. But let's see. So, he posted the links a couple times, and it's like, I don't need to necessarily read the links. It's logic. You can read this, but he's not understanding my point. But so he says, I'm conflating separate concepts. Property is a system of state-imposed wealth redistribution, which, I mean, I just don't even know where this is coming from, especially from a person who considers himself a communist in any sense, anarcho-communist, whatever. Possession is an expression of labor and use. And he's, all of that, I mean, that really doesn't make any sense, right? Property is not. Property is the expression of labor, basically, if you would want to do that, if you want to put it that way. Possession is an expression of labor, but that means it's property. It's the same damn thing. Your possessions are your property, right? And unless you're renting them or whatever, and that's a place where it could kind of diverge there. But you could possess something, but it's not necessarily your rightful property. So, and that's what my reply to that was your possessions are your property, or you borrowed them. And he's like, it's like you're just saying, and I said, I am saying that because you're wrong. Your propositions contradict each other. Property doesn't exist. The capitalists stole. That makes no sense. And then he says they aren't contradictory. You are assuming that only property exist as a mechanism to determine the use and occupancy of physical objects. This is false, as I've noted several times, but it's not false. Okay, like you saying, like they are proposing a different type of property relationships. They're not proposing the abandonment of property. And why it probably seems this way is because we get into this later. And I guess I'll cite right now. One of the fundamental issues here is that communists think that, first of all, they think everyone owns something, which is basically impossible. You know, everyone is a gibberish concept in this term. You know, they're not concrete, they're not distilling what we're talking about far enough down to where you can say, okay, well, the baseball team. Everyone means, in that context, means everyone on the baseball team. You know, they don't really articulate it far enough for it to make any sense when they say everyone owns something, and that will be exposed in this as we go. But so they believe that the concepts of no one owning something and everyone owning something are the same thing. And he does say that, and they've said this over and over again. And when I started exiting this belief system and realizing what I was saying, yeah, that's what I believed, is that everyone and no one owning it is possible. First of all, it's impossible. They say that, he says, quote, de facto, it's the same thing. So in practice, it's the same thing. No, it's not. It's not in practice the same thing, because in belief, it's not even the same thing. In logic, by definition, it is not the same thing. In fact, it's about as opposite as you could get. No one owning it and everyone owning it. And they think that these two things are the same thing and can exist simultaneously when they're two completely different concepts. You know, it's the opposite ends of the spectrum. If no one owns something, then nobody else needs permission to do something with it. If everyone owns something, then the person needs everyone's permission to do something with it. You know, that's what property would imply, because property means it's rightfully owned by someone. I mean, the logistics of the statement, everyone owning it, you know, that doesn't really change that. Within itself, it even makes no sense. You know, no one owning it and everyone owning it are not the same thing. They're completely opposites, and everyone owning it is practically impossible, taken as just generically when they say it so generically like that. And we get into this though, because that would imply then that everyone on the planet is owner of things that no one has labored on. And that is like the complete opposite of any type of sound philosophy you could think of, really, because I mean, and we'll get into this, because he posts another thing where it cites the allegedly Christian view that Earth is our common inheritance through God. So he says they aren't contradictory. You're assuming that only property exists as a mechanism, as the only mechanism, which doesn't even have anything to do with it. I'm assuming that only property exists as a mechanism to determine the use and occupancy of physical objects. Whether that's true or false has no bearing on what your propositions are saying. Like, ownership is ownership, property is property. We're basically working on the same concept of property here, kind of, you know, sort of at the base. But for whatever reason, he thinks if no one owns something, everyone owns it, which, like I said, makes no sense. It's total opposite. So he says again, property is only one mechanism for negotiating this concept. And he's like, what does that mean, this concept? Negotiating how to divide up things, basically. One more, he says, the difference between property and possession, and he posted it. It's like, I've read this before. I don't feel like reading it again. Maybe I should, just to put it in the video so that I do, you know, my due diligence here for this argument. But it really doesn't even matter, because that's not what I'm talking about. Like, first of all, no, it's not. It's just a different. What you are saying is that that our concept of rightful ownership is incorrect, and their concept of rightful ownership is correct. And it's still a basis for how to negotiate. It's still how to divide up the property. Like you saying that, you know, these things are not property, you know, possessions are not property. Dividing up the land is not the same thing as property. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. Yes, it is. You're still viewing it as property. You're just dividing it up in different ways. So, well, okay, he posted it for me, so I don't necessarily have to surf through it. So, okay, he says anarchists define, quote, private property, or just property for short, which is interesting because, yes, Private property is redundant. It's just property or not. Something is either property or not. So as state-protected monopolies of certain objects, which is he's the one conflating things here, okay? Like property is a, quote, monopoly of certain objects in a general sense. Or privileges which are used to control and exploit others. Like, I mean, that's just, what does that even mean? Private property is privileges which are used to control and exploit others. That sounds like total gibberish to me, okay? Because, like, what privileges? Like, now you can say that limited liability is private property, and that statement makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's a concept of a privilege that is extended by the force of law. It's not private. It makes no sense. Possession, on the other hand, is ownership of ownership of things that are not used to exploit others, e.g., a car, a refrigerator, a toothbrush. Which, again, that really makes no sense, because you can use a car to, quote, exploit others. And he later goes into that because he starts talking about I can't rightfully, basically his example is using his car as a taxi. He's the capitalist in the taxi company. He owns the car. He lets someone else drive it. The guy gets a cut. He gets a cut, which is completely legitimate as long as it's voluntary. But so again, that doesn't make any sense, because you can use a car to exploit others. And he cites that example later. So how is a car not private property? It's just a possession because it's not used to exploit. So it's a possession if you're not using it to exploit others, and it becomes private property when you start exploiting others. And it's like, no, it's your private property throughout the entire situation, no matter how you use it, right? Right. I mean, yes, that's what I'm saying. Communists might say no, and it's just like, I don't see how you could say that what you're saying makes any type of sense. This is so ambiguous and weak of a so-called differentiation that it really makes no sense, because you can also use a refrigerator to exploit people by renting it out, right? Wouldn't that be, you rent somebody your freezer space or something, or rent a freezer, and they'll say, well, now you're using it now it's private property, right? And it's like, that doesn't make any sense. So thus many things can be considered as either property or possessions depending on how they're used. So he does mention that, but it's like, the use of the thing does not change whether or not it is your property, right? So he's saying property itself is a state-protected monopoly. I mean, that just has nothing to do with it. Has nothing to do with it whatsoever. So let me go down here so I can try to get to the meat of this stuff instead of, I mean, I'm all over the place, and I don't know, let's see, where am I at? I'm already at 22 minutes. I mean, who the hell's going to watch this? Maybe, but the next one, I'll listen to this again and then try to condense it maybe after this. But so let me get to the point. Let me see if I can get to the point where he says no one and everyone owning it is the same thing. So he posted, let's see. So we get into the example. He posted a picture of a sandcastle and he said, I mixed the beach with my labor. Really, I guess it should have been, I mixed my labor with the beach, thereby homesteading it. It is my property now. The municipal authorities can leave now, and anyone who wants to stay can pay an entrance fee. I don't know why he brings the so-called municipal authorities into it, which that's like kind of what he believes in. Like, look, and I said, the sandcastle is your property. Sure. He said, LOL. And I said, and by nature of reality, the space it takes up. But yeah. And then I said, well, what is your basis for claiming you are part owner of lands no one has labored on? So I guess I maybe could go back a little bit here to get to where we got to that. Yeah, I'm kind of losing it here. Can I pause this thing? Doesn't look like it, I guess. And sorry for the background noise. I wanted to say that at the beginning. Let's see. Where are they at? This looks like good stuff. So he says, okay, so this is where he posted why demos.org. Don't know what that is, but I read a little bit of why property is theft and why something. So I quoted from it. The Christianist idea of the common ownership of all of the earth is Proudhon's starting point. That the belief that God gave all humans the earth to own in common. And I said, that's the wrong starting point. I said, one, this is still property. They're just saying everyone owns it. Two, how can you be entitled to land no one has labored on simply by being born? So really, he is the one who believes that simply claiming things are yours and never laboring on them actually makes them your property, because he's saying that's property and we're against that. I'm against that too, because that's not actually property. That's not rightfully property, see? And that's the meat of this whole thing, 24 minutes into it, which sucks kind of. And then I said, are aliens also entitled to Earth? If not, then that is property, because you are excluding others, right? Which would make perfect sense even in their case where Earth is common ownership of everyone born here. It's still property. That's what I'm saying is the point of that. But my answer to that is no, that aliens are not entitled to Earth, but not because they aren't born on Earth, because they have not labored upon anything to create anything on the Earth for which could be their property, or funded anyone else to build it, because that could also be legitimate investment, right? So, and then it says in there, it says at the beginning, quote, in the beginning, everyone can access and use every single piece of the earth at their will. And I said, no, you cannot. You and I cannot occupy the same place at the same time. Regardless of this whole property argument, those words as stated fly in the face of physical reality. It is impossible. And that is why we have over time developed this concept of, quote, property rights to decide what is the most ethical and efficient way to distribute those things which are not public goods. Because public goods, you cannot physically, it is impossible for you to disallow others from using it. And there's only a couple of examples of public goods, a radio broadcast being one, television broadcasts, things like this, where you cannot stop someone from consuming it if they have a receiver. That's a public good. So obviously none of those things which they think are, like land is not a public good, because you can only occupy so much of it. You can, even just your use by itself, you standing there in three-dimensional space restricts someone else from being able to stand there. And so that's why we have this concept of property rights. That's why it all comes about. So anyway, regardless as stated, those words fly in the face of reality. One, and this is the first time I mentioned this because this is the implications of this. One, owned by all, or no, this is what he says, sorry. So he says, one, owned by all and unowned are de facto equivalents in practice. And that is completely false. Completely false. If you think that it's owned by everyone, your practice is not going to be to not control it, which is the fundamental result of owned by no one and unowned, right? So he says, two, no one has the right to restrict your freedom of movement or common use of the land. Which land? Even the arguments related to laboring upon land, granting a claim to exclude others to it, support this as a necessary corollary. If no one has yet labored upon it, no one has a right to exclude others from it. And I don't understand where he's coming from here, because that is my argument. That is my argument I said, yes, I am not arguing against that. That is my entire point. If no one has yet labored upon it, then it is not the, quote, commons, meaning owned by everyone, because no one has the right to exclude others from it, because it's no one's property. And that does not translate to owned by everyone. They're complete opposites. In order for it to be owned by everyone would have had to have put some type of labor into it or funded it in some way. And he's saying that things that have not been labored upon are owned by everyone, which is completely, it's contradictory to the entire concept here. Like, what is his basis for claiming that it's owned by everyone? Well, the Christian idea that God gave everyone the earth to share in common. And it's just like, really? That's your argument? Like that, especially coming from a communist who probably thinks he's an atheist. It's like, it's a pretty bizarre justification, attempt to justify that. And I said, if no one has labored on it, no one has the right to exclude. Right. I'm not arguing against that. That is why claiming someone cannot cut a forest down if no one has labored on it, makes no sense, which is the communist position. They will stop a capitalist from claiming this as their own property, or anybody else from claiming this as their own property, you know? But they're saying that it's everybody's property, but somehow, you know, nobody labored on it, but it's everyone's property. And then I said, claiming common ownership in this way is claiming ownership of literally everything that no one has labored on. So everything that's unowned. And he later says this. Let me scroll down because there's a bit of a discussion here. And he literally says that. He said something about the commons again. And then I said, where is it? And he says, I'm claiming the beach is the commons, part of the sandcastle argument. And I said, yeah, but it's not. And I said, so what do you mean by the commons? Oh, where's it at? I thought that was it. He says, I said, dude, you're claiming the beach is all your property. So he says, you know, he's saying that he mixed his labor with the beach, and that makes the beach his property. And it's like just that one section. And I said, that's what you believe, that you mixing your labor on the beach, you building a sandcastle means you own the whole beach. That is not what any of us are saying. That's what you're saying. And he says, and it is precisely as valid as any other property claim. And I said, dude, you're claiming the beach is all of our property. Like, you are making a property claim, which is actually the absurd one. It's not absurd to say that if you build a house on the beach, that section of the beach is yours. That makes perfect sense, understanding that production is the basis of labor. Why else would somebody own something? By being born here? So by being born here, you are part owner of every single inch on land, is the implication of his belief, which makes no type of sense whatsoever and is perpetual conflict. Because how are we possibly going to decide? We would have to have 7 billion people to participate in some democracy type system here to decide if I'm allowed to build a house on a beach that nobody else is at. You know, like, that's totally crazy. And he says, I'm claiming it's the commons. And somewhere down here, I ask him, oh, here it is, the commons. And what you mean by this is every inch of land, water, etc., correct? Because he said earlier that the whole planet is common between all of us. You know, he said that is the starting point of his philosophy. So that, I mean, even in that sense, it's the same way everyone works. It loses all meaning because it means everything. So what are you really talking about? And then he says, and then this is where he says it. The commons is whatever isn't for the special use of specific persons or groups. And I was just like, wow, there's nothing vague about that. I mean, I was like, what? The commons is anything that isn't owned. Is that what you are saying? And he said, it isn't really that vague. If something isn't in the possession of someone for their personal use, then it should be for common use. And it's like, no, he's almost there. But the problem is that he thinks that everyone owning it, which is an absurd concept to begin with, is the same thing as no one owning it. No, it is not the same thing. And then so I paraphrased, everything that is not in use belongs to everyone. And he said, sure, although it needn't be active in use at all times. And he says this because then you realize that if you leave your house for 10 minutes, it's up for grabs, right? But I said that doesn't make sense, especially because he said no one is even occupying or using it. So even by their concept of occupancy and use, how does it revert to being everyone's property? No, it is no one's property. It is no one's property. And he said they're de facto the same thing. I prefer to say the commons. And I said, no, they're not the same thing. They're as opposite as you can get. In practice, there would be no difference. False, he said that. False, because in practice, if you believe that everyone owns it, then there's going to be someone trying to control it. If you believe that no one owns it, then you are not going to be trying to control it, right? That would be no one owning it in practice, meaning that you would not stop somebody from claiming it as their property, you know? So their whole belief system, these are the most a blatant contradictory elements of this belief system right here. No one owns it is the same thing as everyone owns it. No, it's not. It's the exact opposite. In fact, it's just far opposite from both sides of these. It's the most extreme opposites that you could possibly get. No one owns it. Everyone owns it. Like it should be pretty self-evident and intuitive by this if you have an understanding of what ownership means and what these concepts and words mean. But I mean, I don't know. Like, it seems like we're working on the same basis of property at the bottom of it all, but somewhere along the way, there's this crazy divergence that I don't even understand entirely myself. Because, I mean, I understand here. He thinks that no one owning is the same thing as everyone owning it. It is not the same thing. So, and that is the communist belief. I would say that is probably the fundamental basis of their belief, is that Earth is common between all of us. But then that gives you no type of basis on how to go forward in an ethical manner. I mean, I guess, not even, because if you believe in democracy, well, why is it ethical that the majority decides? If no one owns it, then it should not go to, quote, common use. It should be left alone, and somebody can go in there and claim it. You know, so if it's no one's, so that's the whole problem here, is they say it's no one's property. Well, if you say it's no one's property, then you are saying that you do not have the right to stop someone from doing anything with it, as long as they're not violating your property right. But that is not your property. Saying something is no one's property is saying it is not your property. It is not everyone's property. It's the exact opposite of saying that it's everyone's property. And so those were just, you know, I just fleshed this out. I mean, this was a really long video. But I think I did a pretty good job of illustrating those beliefs and why they're self-contradictory, why there's a completely contradictory set of beliefs here. There's two contradictory premises. But yeah, so, I mean, that's just where I'm at. I guess I'll end it right now at 36 minutes and 43 seconds. Jeez. Peace.